Hello and welcome. I am Daisy, your hostess. Did you bring your credentials? We are here at the checkpoint, heading back in time to about mid 200 CE on our way to Greece. I don't know exactly what we're looking for, but I am told that we're going to find something that will ring truth. What you're looking for may be different than what I'm looking for, yet the beauty is we all find something that sheds light on our particular journey. Oh, you're asking how did we get here? Well, I got a few tips pointing me in this direction. One was by Ken Wheeler, who has a channel called Theoria Apophysis. He translates Greek and writes articles on metaphysics, specifically Neoplatonic content. And he has the Enneads on his top must-read list. And coincidentally, not to confuse one bald tattooed man with another, Dr. Hillman, who was a philologist of ancient Greek, he runs a channel called Lady Babylon. He also recommended the reading, both unrelated. Dr. Hillman was trying to make a point that there was drug use in ancient Greece. Plotinus was a Greek Platonist philosopher, born and raised in Roman Egypt. Plotinus is regarded by modern scholarships as the founder of Neoplatonism. His teacher was the self-taught philosopher Ammonius Saccas. I am not a scholar, nor do I speak Greek, so lucky for us we have Stephen McKenna, who will provide the translation. In the series of upcoming videos, we will be looking at all of these, and this video is only the introduction, Plotinus' Place in the History of Thought, by Paul Henry. And this is to give us a flavor of who this man was. The first Ennead, which is the first series of videos, deals with the fundamental principles of the universe, focusing on ethical and cosmological concepts. You might ask, what do ancient Greece and Rome have to do with us, here and now? I believe we're standing on the shoulders of previous civilizations. We just didn't happen. You can look around, and for those with eyes to see and ears to hear, will see that the philosophical foundations that destroyed Greece and Rome are very much with us today. Some so well hidden, yet in plain sight, to the point of appearing natural. Yet traces are evident in our politics, architecture, and religions. Like Christianity, Neoplatonism has its own version of providence. While not directly his student, Plotinus was deeply influenced by Plato. Little did he know that he would in the future be considered the father of Neoplatonism, and much of the biographical information about Plotinus comes from Porphyry, his student, and you can find it in the preface to his edition of Plotinus' Enneads, which I'm leaving that for your own research and read. This is enough that I'm providing this here. My interest on this Plotinus sojourn is to look at the catalyst that added embers to the religion, culture, and politics of today. What did they morph from? I discovered traces of what I was looking for in the works of Plotinus. The cult known in ancient times as the Mysteries or the Mystery cults. Plotinus made reference in the first Aeneid. One instance in the 5th tractate titled Happiness and Extension of Time, where he appears to be describing the first principle, God, the realm of flux, and he makes the following statement, quote, "This is the meaning hidden in the mysteries," end quote. Keep in mind, those that participated in the mystery were sworn to secrecy. Some scholars suggest Plato was influenced by mystery cults like the Eleusinian mysteries and the Orphic cults, and his philosophy may reflect their teachings and practices. What went on in those mystery cults? Your guess is as good as mine, yet clues are left in the language of songs, poems, and art scattered in ancient works. Enough to get a glimpse of what was going on. Sure, it may be a time in humanity where it seems that everybody was going amok, but medicine had to start somewhere. And of course there's going to be a derivative or a branch that just goes for pleasure and other things. And sexuality there was no such thing as a defined sex partner. I mean, homosexuality was normal in those days. And these things were going on also in the religions. And as ugly as it is, you'll find that many would like to cover that up. But you just can't cover up ugly. It's there. It's there, and it's inside these texts. And if you look, you'll find it and make sense of it. Some people will say, well, that's just a metaphor. Well, can you call it a metaphor when you see it repeated in too many forms of work, whether it's in another text by another author, or in a song by a different author, or in artworks by different authors? Is it just, metaphor? I don't think so. Dr. Hillman says that there is enough ancient text to infer that even Jesus was practicing the mystery, a word that is used loosely in Christianity, a word that could imply illicit acts by today's moral compass. The other clue was in the Plotinus' ninth tractate titled The Reasoned Dismissal. And I'll quote, it says, "To call upon drugs to the release of the soul seems a strange way of assisting its purposes." End quote. Now, was Plotinus referring to the use of drugs to disconnect from the body as used in the mysteries, to induce, a state of death via a venom, and then this death to be an invitation to connect with ionic life, and then with that aid of an anti-venom to come back with that experience and be reborn again? I wonder if that could be like the ayahuasca experience that many talk about today. I know it sounds crazy, but crazy is when you begin looking at ancient texts, not just theology, but history, poetry, music, and art. And they were not hiding it. In the context of the time period, it was just another day. And pederasty was socially acceptable. Today, that is very much scorned. I thought it only fair to share with you this introduction that is offered in this book to learn more about Plotinus, unbeknown to himself, the man who would affect today's Christianity. This is a personal quest to me because for the longest time, I accepted religion because it was handed down to me. I never questioned it, but I have seen so many horrors as a police officer which would lead any sane person to question, why would a God allow such a thing? Fortunately, I'm retired now and I have the luxury and time to go on these quests. Don't get me wrong, I have my personal faith, and I am clear that faith and religion are not the same thing. Faith and science are not the same thing. Faith and philosophy are not the same thing. There are things I take on faith. Such things are ineffable, and to put into words would do it no justice. But surely, these three branches try, and it's worth listening to that. Keep in mind, I'm also looking at how Christianity got its birth. Putting things into perspective here, in 332 CE, or Anno Domini 80, whichever one you choose. For example, Constantine commissioned 50 copies of Christian scriptures for his foundations from the biblical scholar Eusebius of Caesarea. Christian writings began to be gathered together for review. Unfortunately, Constantine died before he could see his request fulfilled. The canon of the Bible was developed over time through various councils and popes of the Catholic Church, starting with the Council of Rome in 382 AD. Plotinus began his works on the Enneads starting around 253 AD. That's years before Constantine got his brainy idea, and during the decline of the polytheism of the Greek. So when change happens, you don't really see it. But when you look back, you're like, then you could start putting your linear marks on it. And you will notice that there is still the influence of Greek gods as Plotinus mentions them throughout the literature. I bring this up because it helps paint the picture of the influencing ideas floating around and also the context of certain events that were taking place. The end of antiquity is really marked by the ascendancy of Christianity and the fall of the Roman Empire, which obviously didn't happen in tandem. There was this shift happening in the thinking, in the minds of people, Eventually, they were starting to become disappointed with the chaotic time period that they were living in, and they started looking to the past for things when times were better. And philosophy was no exception. This was kind of the beginning of the end of the poly-religions and into monotheism. People recognized that Plato had a huge body of work that was compatible with these new monotheistic religions that were cropping up at the time. And there were various schools of thoughts: the Cynics, the Stoics, the Skeptics, the Epicureans, and you could throw the Neoplatonism and the Aristotelianism in there. And part of the Stoicism and Platonist belief was that the key to living a happy life is living a virtuous life. And some of those concepts were being espoused by Christianity. Some of the concepts that Plotinus believed and that he was throwing out there was that the world is a span between two poles. At one end is the divine light, which he called the One. Sometimes he called it God. On the other end is the absolute darkness, which receives none of the light from the One. And to his point, he was saying that this darkness actually has no existence. It simply is the absence of light. In other words, it's not there. All that exists is God, or the One. And now I invite you to grab all your credentials. Come on, let's go destination Greece. Let's meet up with Plotinus. Let's see what we're going to discover. Hopefully, it'll be a treasure or two and help you understand the things around you as we look at the past and reconcile with the future. And before we jump into these treatises and these Enneads that Plotinus offers, this video only contains this introduction. And with that, we'll turn the page. Plotinus's Place in the History of Thought, written by Paul Henry, a renowned scholar of Plotinus and also Neoplatonism. Plotinus holds a very important place in the history of thought, important in philosophy, more important in theology, and in the development of mysticism. Heir to the great philosophies of the ancient world, those of Plato, Aristotle, and the Stoics, he borrowed from all of them the insights of which he needed, but without surrendering at any point the dominant influence of Platonism. Eclectic in appearance, but powerfully unified by the strength of a single pervading impulse, his system has, by various channels, often obscure and often indirect, come to be and remained one of the guiding forces in the thought of the West, whether Christian or secular, from Augustine and Scotus Eurigena to Diningi and Bergson. He is the last great philosopher of antiquity, and yet in more than one respect, and notably in the stress which he places on the autonomy of spirit, he is a precursor of modern times. He is in the West the founder of that speculative mysticism which expresses in intellectual, or rather supra-intellectual, and negative categories the stages and states of union with the absolute. It is a mysticism wholly philosophical, transposed into a new key which is specifically Platonian, and it differs very greatly from the mysticism of St. Paul or St. John, with which through the centuries it runs parallel or combines, often almost unconsciously, though at times also it is in conflict with the gospel mysticism. Porphyry published the works of his master Plotinus, 2004 to 270, at the beginning of the 4th century, about 304. That is to say, just when Christianity was about to become under Constantine the official religion of the empire, and when, above all, Christian thought was about to reflect in the full light of day, through its theologians and its councils, upon the biblical revelation, and to set itself the task, while remaining faithful to that revelation, of expressing it in new terms. 10 centuries of the Middle Ages, though knowing nothing of the Enneads of Plotinus, remained paradoxically enough, if only through the meditation of St. Augustine and the Pseudo-Dionysius, closely dependent upon his thought. Of St. Thomas Aquinas, Dining could write, not without exaggeration, but with some plausibility, that he was nearer to Plotinus than to the real Aristotle. The Renaissance, in the person of Marsilio Ficino, rediscovered his works and was enthralled by his teaching. Later, such religious thinkers as the Cambridge Plotinus, such philosophers as Berkeley and Hegel, such poets as Novalis and Goethe, interested themselves in him and contributed by this interest towards the creation of an atmosphere in which his works, having been edited, translated, and explained, are no more obscure than those of the many-sided Aristotle or of their common master, the divine Plato. It is not the aim of this introduction to discuss for their own sake the themes, even the essential themes of Plotinus thought. The thing has been excellently done many times already. The most we can do is to seize upon certain controversial but characteristic points which may help us to determine his proper historical setting. It may, in other words, be of interest to consider him as a link in an unbroken chain which extends from Plato to Bergson, as a thinker inspired by his predecessors and by the God who is in him, and in turn inspiring many of those who came after him. At the risk of often simplifying extremely complex problems, yet kalos o kindunos, and without being able always to exhibit the detailed reasons in support of opinions sometimes summarily expressed, we have to try to uncover the time-honored themes which were inherited from Greece and above all from Plato, were transmuted by the prevailing interest of Plotinus' own epoch and by his personal genius, and which went on to impress themselves deeply upon certain abiding traditions of Western thought. If he had been able to foresee and to measure in advance his influence on the Christian or de-Christianized West, he would have attributed entirely to the exceptional and indeed, in his view, unique value of the authentic Platonism of Plato, a Plato not transmuted and transposed, but rediscovered and revitalized. It is not rare for great philosophers to claim the authority of an illustrious predecessor and to ensure his survival through the power of their own creative genius, acting in a spirit of loyalty without servility. Aristotelianism itself, in a sense the most formidable adversary of Plato and of his disciple Plotinus, lives on in large areas of Western thought and notably in Western theology through the influence of St. Thomas Aquinas, who, it may be added, was perhaps more strongly tinged with Platonism than he often himself realized. Perhaps it is a characteristic of certain great philosophers of originality and power to associate themselves closely with a great predecessor whose work they can recapture without merely reproducing it and can transcend while never abandoning it. It is perhaps this creative loyalty which gives to the term philosophia perennis, whatever meaning it may possess. Plotinus, Augustine, and St. Thomas occupy in this respect similar positions in the history of thought, and perhaps we may include in their company Plato himself if we remember his obscure but well-attested relationship with the Pythagoreans and Socrates. Since it is largely through Christian thought that Plotinus, like Aristotle, has influenced the thought of the West, we shall expect not only to underline the continuity of Plotinus' Hellenism with Christian thought, but also to indicate where, in crucial matters, they part company. It will then be seen, even though the point cannot be elaborated, how in certain respects Christian values, secularized and detached from their original context, sometimes revert to the pure rationalism or the mystical rationalism of Platonism, and sometimes, as in certain types of phenomenology and existentialism, remain on the philosophical plane, nearer to the Aristotelian and Judeo-Christian tradition than to the Greek idealism of Plato and Plotinus. 1. Socrates and the soul. It is not easy to state precisely what Plotinus owes to Socrates. Socrates' teaching is difficult to reconstitute, and Plotinus, even more than ourselves, knew it only through the dialogues of Plato, so that his debt to Socrates is a debt to Plato. Moreover, he scarcely refers to him and never invokes his authority. If it is true that Socrates was perhaps the first man in Europe who had a clear and coherent conception of the soul as we understand it, that is the moral and intellectual personality, the responsible agent in knowing and acting rightly or wrongly, then Plotinus, along with almost the whole of Greek philosophy, and with Plato in particular, owes to Socrates the very center of his thought. At the close of his career, in his treatise on Man, He observes that whether we adhere to the Platonic tradition in which the body is the soul's instrument, or to the Aristotelian in which the soul is the body's form or act, the essential human being is identified with what we should nowadays call his ego or self. Antos is never the composite body-soul, but always the soul. Thus, at one stroke, Plotinus is in opposition to the biblical and Judeo-Christian conception, which declines to recognize any fundamental opposition, even a logical one, between soul and body. The conception of the soul as the seat of the personality prepares the way for Christianity, and the fact that Plotinus, following Socrates and Plato, concentrates his teaching on this cardinal point goes perhaps some way to explain the deep-seated influence which he exercised on the first Christian thinkers and on the mystical tradition of the West. Nevertheless, this very idealism, the spiritual egotism, accentuates the difference between even a Hellenized form of Christianity and Hellenism pure and simple. Neither Socrates nor Plato took sufficient note of the will factor. In their teaching there is no place, as moreover there is none in Aristotle, for sin and plenary responsibility. In this matter Plotinus strove, unsuccessfully, as he realized, to bring harmony into the contradictory affirmations of Plato. On the one hand, the soul is free, self-impelled, responsible in its fall, and in the desire to belong to itself, isolated from the whole and from its source. On the other hand, its descent is necessary for ensuring the government, life, and ordering of the universe. Briefly, we have categorically assertion, without any adequate explanation, of the ontos and the cosmos, the ego and the universal order. The central doctrine of Socrates is that virtue is knowledge. Plotinus agrees. The intellect with which the soul, in the higher phase of its life, is identified, is without sin and strictly incapable of sinning. Vice is not a perversion of intelligence, but a condition in which this activity is absent or dormant. Wrongdoing is not so much rebellion and defiance as bewilderment and weariness. Where wrongdoing simply does not exist, there can of course be no place either for pardon and expiation nor for salvation. Such notions or values imply an absolute freedom which Plotinus denies to the soul and denies to the divinity, whether as identified with the one which is his absolute or with the intellect and the universal soul. Penance and repentance give place to forgetfulness. The contrast with the biblical revelation and with certain lines of thought in the ancient Near East is complete. Where the Christian sees tragic contradiction, the Neoplatonist diagnoses a weakness or incapacity. It is significant that Platonian mysticism, although so negative and so demanding, acknowledges neither disquiet nor anguish, nor the darkness nor the night of the spirit of Paul, of Gregory of Nyssa, of Augustine, of Teresa of Avila, of John of the Cross. Denudation is not sacrifice. For the Alexandrian, as for Socrates, complete attention and perfect consent, far from being the conditions of sin, make any offense impossible. Spirit cannot sin. Wrongdoing in Plotinus is perhaps allied to the Buddhist conception of wrongdoing or to Spinoza's doctrine of the inadequate idea. Furthermore, despite a number of Stoicism affirmations to the contrary and the adaptation of the doctrine of universal sympathy, man is for Plotinus fundamentally isolated. He is not, as he is for Aristotle and perhaps even Plato in the Laws, a political animal. There are not in the Enneads deux sources de la morale et de la religion. In the pursuit of happiness, in the search for God, society has no place. The sage is a monad, basically unrelated to any other monad. No solidarity exists of man with man, whether in good or in evil. How different from Judaism and Christianity, in which the doctrine of original sin, so difficult for Greek rationalism, plays a fundamental part. Finally, salvation is not to be achieved. It is achieved. For its realization, it is enough that the individual should become conscious of what he is already in his inmost nature, where intellect, which is beyond the virtues, identifies itself with true being and with the idea which one forms of the self, of the world, and of God. The anchoritism of the soul and of God excludes at once all sacramentalism and all true history of becoming. The latent actuality of salvation and the cold transcendence of God make it impossible in terms of Plotinian Socratism to conceive of any genuine doctrine of grace. This sort of outlook, which is really not so much arrogant as individualist and intellectualist, has strongly influenced and in view of the gospel message, perhaps unduly, some Christian ascetics who, following in the footsteps of Plotinus, have sought salvation in flight and union with God in solitude. By and large, however, the Socratic heritage, which is the conviction of the existence and supreme dignity of the human soul as a traveler in eternity and an amphibian hovering between two worlds, the heritage which has rethought by Plato and transposed by Plotinus into a mysticism more rational or rationalistic than religious, was on the way to cementing a centuries-long alliance with the gospel revelation and, through it, with virtually all the great philosophies of the West. Philosophies which, though often freed from theological tutelage, were nevertheless born in Christian soil. The philosophies, let us say, of Thomas Aquinas and of Spinoza, of Descartes and of Kant. It is only in our own day that we see influential schools of empiricism and behaviorism, Marxism, logical positivism, existentialism, all deviating from the Platonic tradition and from Christian intellectualism, a deviation which is perhaps their only common denominator. 2. The ideas and the God of Plato. Plotinus would have been surprised at being thought of as the founder of a new school, Neoplatonism. He considered himself a Platonist pure and simple, without prefix or qualification. In other words, as an interpreter and follower of Plato. Plato, in his view, possessed the truth, the whole truth. In his polemic against the Gnostics, he accuses them either of plagiarizing Plato or, when they abandon him, to split hairs and invent new doctrines of departing from the truth. That Plotinus' claim was sincere is not in doubt, however much it may astonish us, finding, as we do, a different system implicit in the Enneads, and also a different spirit from that of the dialogues. Where Plato presents us with the stages of a thought forever inquiring and forever moving beyond itself, Plotinus finds achieved results. Dialectic becomes metaphysics. What was dynamic takes on the garb of fixity. Though the breath of mystical aspiration which dominates the Enneads confers its own powerful impulse upon the whole. A small number of texts, almost always the same, are torn from their context, erected into axioms. Quote, "Phesin," unquote, which normally has Plato for its subject, is almost an antos epha, and then sprung together, often fanciful, are organized to form a body of doctrine. On occasion, however, Plotinus, falling back into the role of interpreter, can recognize in Plato obscurities, hesitations, contradictions, though only in rare cases is he willing or able to strike out on a line of his own. 3 essential points of doctrine in Plato are essential also for Plotinus. Subject to important corrections and amplifications, they remain fundamental in the philosophical tradition of the West, whether this tradition has remained Christian or become secularized. If Plato lives on, it is largely in a Plotinian context, and therefore with a new accent. If Plato and Plotinus are still alive, it is in a great measure because Christianity, finding a natural ally in the Platonic idealism, has taken over its principal doctrines, though not without rethinking them. First, There is the clear distinction between the world of eternity and the world of time, between the ideas and the sensible, between here and beyond. This relaxed dualism, which is different from radical dualism, whether Gnostic or Manichaean, is later to enter the lists against, but through the doctrine of creation to achieve a fusion with the relaxed monism, different from pantheism of Semitic and biblical thought. Then there is the doctrine, going back to Socrates, of the immateriality and immortality of the soul. Here again, Christian reflection is almost as much opposed to Plato and Plotinus as it is inspired by them. Finally, there's the doctrine of the absolute transcendence of God, located beyond even the ideas and being. On these three dogmas, Christianity and Platonism at once agree and disagree, with a tension between them which would be unthinkable without the existence of a deep-rooted affinity. 1. The two worlds. The distinction and opposition between the intelligible world and the sensible world, which are nevertheless bound together by participation, is an axiom which Plotinus feels no need to demonstrate, but which he stresses many times over. The unintelligible world, with the three principal hypostases which mark the grades in its structure, represents for Plotinus the sphere of the divine realities. All the idealism, all the essentialism of the Christian tradition of philosophy and of the secular metaphysical systems which derive from it is here found in embryo, and neither the creationist doctrine of the East, nor the dogma of the incarnation and the sacramentalism, nor the rediscovery of Aristotle, who brought the forms back into things, will ever prevent this schema from remaining fundamental and inspiring reflection, asceticism, and speculative mysticism. Would it be going too far to suggest that Kant's distinction between the phenomenon and the noumenon, in spite of significant differences, descends from this tradition? 2. The immateriality of the soul. The belief that the soul is immaterial was far from being shared by the Greeks. In this respect, Plato, Aristotle, and Plotinus are fairly isolated from the main Greek tradition and a long way from that rarefied materialism which Armstrong calls the pneumatic type of thought, and which, envisaging the soul as tenuous matter, has representatives through the whole range of Greek thought from Homer to the Stoics, not to mention the Manichaeans, who were not Greeks at all, and which lingers on in Tertullian. The Socrates of the Phaedo had taken up the cause of the immortality of the soul. In Plotinus' very first treatise on beauty, one of the simplest and most attractive and undoubtedly the most read of all his works, he follows Plato in locating the essence of beauty, even of sensible beauty, not in symmetry of parts, as the Stoics had done, but in a non-material principle, in participation in the ideal beauty of the intelligible world, and by this device the theme of idealism becomes associated with that of relaxed dualism. His second treatise on the immortality of the soul re-employs once more against the Stoics but also against the Pythagorean doctrine of the soul as a harmony and the Aristotelian theory of the soul as an entelechy. The essential theme of the Phaedo, which it justifies by a almost scholastic, discussion of the utter immateriality of the soul, a discussion which contains, as Breyer observes, a storehouse of arguments destined to be used by every future spiritualist. Without going so far as to include Aristotle among the materialists, Plotinus attacks him vigorously on two grounds. He rejects his doctrine of the soul as the body's form, entelechy, act or actuality of the body, and emphasizes by implication the radical difference between spiritual and physical, a difference which was to dominate very largely the ethical and metaphysical teaching of the Western world up to the time of St. Thomas, and the integration of Aristotelian psychology, together with a good deal of Aristotelian ethics, into Christian thought. Along with Plato, Plotinus clings firmly to the personal development of souls and their survival after death, at least in the sense that separated from the body, a soul can receive punishments and rewards in the afterlife. Aristotle, immaterialist though he is far from being equally clear and categorical on this point, as medieval and modern controversies have shown plainly enough. Christian thought will follow Plato and Plotinus in this matter, without, however, accepting the doctrine of metempsychosis, which is bound up with a particular conception of time and eternity, of creation and of history, which the biblical revelation found it difficult to assimilate. Similarly, Christianity, like Platonism, will look to absolute standards, indeed often to God himself, for the laws of conduct, whereas Aristotelian empirism, unless corrected, is inclined to lead towards relativism and scientific humanism. A vital role is assigned by Plotinus to the inner experience, the return upon oneself, which is described in the wonderful opening of the treatise 4. Quote, "Often I awaken to myself and escape from the body." End quote. In the equation between contemplation and action lies the very center of Plotinus' metaphysics. Here beats the very heart of his system. No doubt the warm feeling of inwardness which marks the essay on contemplation is common at this period to Neoplatonism, to Gnosticism, and to Christianity, whose affinities have been more and more closely observed in our day, only to make us increasingly aware of their irreducible antagonism. Plotinus is always nearer to Plato than to Aristotle. His metaphysics, therefore, is not so much metaphysics as metapsychology, and his theodicy leads not from the movement of the spheres to the unmoved mover, but from the soul's desire to that one which alone can satisfy it. His starting point is not nature, but soul. The soul, an amphibian and a traveler, reascends through the power of the dialectic to intellect, and then by a process of purification, of utter simplification, arrives at the point of contact with the pure and simple absolute, the One. It is multivalent in its nature, and without leaving the intelligible world, it makes a constant passage to and fro, and so again descends to consciousness and the world of experience. In contrast with the Gospel, Plotinus does not go so far as to conceive the soul in opposition to the world of sin, since in point of fact he recognizes neither sin nor salvation. But on the other hand, he is without awareness of any true eschatology, and is no more concerned with the doctrine of the resurrection of the body than the Areopagites addressed by St. Paul. He pours scorn on the Gnostics, and by implication on the Christians, who in this respect were their allies for making man the center of the universe and the subject of a redemption. But he stands with the Gnostics against the Christians in maintaining that the soul must rely on its own unaided efforts to reach the goal of its destiny. Plotinus' system is never explicit. It is not articulated into theorems, as in the case with Proclus or in the question with St. Thomas, but is throughout implicitly present as a totality in each particular theme. Its characteristic feature is the intimate conjunction, amounting to fusion of two problems, the religious and the philosophical. The problem of the soul, of its actuality, its states and its experiences, and the problem of the world, its objects and their rational explanation. What is new, even in the doctrine, which is usually considered typically Platonian, of the three hypostases, the one, intellect, and soul, is not the letter, but the spirit. It is the notion of making the ideas, states of being of the intellect, and no longer distinct objects, of bringing the very subject of thought into the intelligible world, of considering the hypostases less as entities than as spiritual attitudes. His theology is a synthesis of cosmogony, cosmos equals world, and psychogony, psyche equals soul. Without ceasing to obey the commands of reason, Plotinus is in his most philosophical passages constantly borne along by a deep mystical impulse. As a result, his religious thought is as much opposed to ordinary representations of the universe in the salvation religions as his philosophical thought is to Greek rationalism. He hardly ever appeals to his own personal experience, and though he may sometimes adopt the style of the devotional diatribe, we are far removed from the pulsating confessions of St. Augustine, in which philosophical problems and problems of the inner life are inextricably interwoven. The last words of Plotinus, which are not, as has been believed through the centuries, a disclosure of his own dying thoughts, but a maxim bequeathed to the living as a legacy, sum up and express with his customary perspicuity and tact the one concerning of the philosopher and the spiritual director. Quote, "Strive to bring back the God in yourselves to the divine in the universe." End quote. 3. The transcendence of God. Plotinus identifies as a matter of course the good of the Republic and the absolute one of the first hypotheses of the Parmenides. This identification, which, in the words of Plato, situates the good beyond being and which denies to the one all multiplicity, be it only virtual and logical, a multiplicity of names, attributes, forms, or aspects, constitutes the basis of the negative theology which, in Plotinus and in his disciples, plays so great a part in the doctrine of God and the mystical experience. The problem of sources is here particularly difficult. The true thought of Plato on the nature of his God and of his religion is still a matter of controversy. Moreover, the philosophers who formed the connecting links between Plato and Plotinus are very imperfectly known, especially the middle Platonists whose works, read by Plotinus, have since perished. We do not even know what he owed to the inspiration of Ammonius Saccas, his teacher. The problem is nonetheless of considerable importance. The reply which we give to the question of the origin of the Platonian doctrine of the three hypostases, the one, intellect, and soul, largely determines the significance and bearing of this doctrine in the Enneads, and, consequently, the extent of Plotinus' real originality and his place in the history of ideas. The question may take either of two forms, which must be carefully distinguished from each other. To whom did Plotinus believe himself to be indebted for his doctrine? To whom was he in fact indebted? In other words, what is the true source of the theory of the three hypostases and of the transcendent one? The answer to the first question is perfectly clear. In one of his very first treatises, and one of the most revealing of all, on the three principal hypostases, which Porphyry placed somewhat astutely at the beginning of the Theological Aeneid, and which is the treatise most often quoted by the Fathers of the Church, Plotinus explicitly connects the distinction between the one, intellect, and soul with the three ones of the first three hypotheses of the Parmenides, and asserts emphatically that his doctrine is not new, and that it is in complete agreement with Plato, who, he adds, is more precise than the Parmenides of history. Furthermore, he associates the doctrine thus interpreted with an obscure passage in Plato's second letter, which he often quotes, and indeed once misquotes, and in which reference is made to three ranks of precedence among the higher realities. By combining these passages, no doubt unwarrantably, with others in the Timaeus and with the well-known passage in the Republic, he obtains his hierarchy of the intelligible world. Plotinus remains consistently faithful to this interpretation and this systemization. In fact, a series of key phrases in the Enneads recall, by their close and almost word-for-word parallelism, phrases of the first two hypotheses of the Parmenides, though not the third, and the God of Plotinus, in contrast with the intellect, is therefore described, with whatever justice to Plato's genuine thought, in terms which are Platonic. The one is the one and nothing else. And even to assert that it is or that it is one is false, since it is beyond being or essence. No name can apply to it. It eludes all definition, all knowledge. It can neither be perceived nor thought. It is not in movement, nor is it at rest. It is infinite without limits, and since it has no parts, it is without structure and without form. The second hypostasis, as distinct from the first which transcends it, is extracted exegetically from the second hypothesis of the Parmenides, and it is to this that the predicates of being and thought belong, predicates often contrary but dialectically combined. The same expressions return, but they are influenced by a new factor. In contradistinction from the one par excellence, intellect is one in many, the soul being in turn a one and many. It is at once in movement and at rest, infinite like the one, but infinite in a different way, and for the reason that its essence is broken up into an infinity of parts, which are each identical with intellect as a whole, and which have nevertheless the power of remaining severally distinct. In Section 3, Plato, Aristotle, and the Stoics. 1 absolute, 3 hypostases. In the same treatise 5, Plotinus attacks Aristotle's assertion that the first principle, transcendent and intelligible, thinks itself, an assertion which, in his view, is tantamount to abrogating its primacy. Here, Plotinus goes back directly to Parmenides and to his dictum that to think and to be are the same thing, and he is thus able to establish beneath the one, which is their cause, intellect, the intelligible, being, and essence, all on the same level. If he fails to find the identity of intellect and being explicitly affirmed by Plato, he can, on the other hand, infer from the Republic that the ideas are essences, can identify the animal in itself of the Timaeus with his own intellect, and proceeding along this road, can read into the dialogues what is specifically an Aristotelian doctrine. For, in the last resort, it is without a doubt to Aristotle rather than to Plato that he owes the fundamental principle that the thought par excellence is self-thought, in which intelligence and intelligible coincide. We have here, as well known, one of the most characteristic descriptions of the unmoved first mover, Aristotle's absolute, which is as indifferent to and as distant and detached from the world of man as is the one of the Enneads. If we recall that the soul of the world, the third hypostasis, while being transcendent to the sensible world, is yet the seat of providence, and that it exhibits certain features which remind us of the immanent God of the Stoics, we may be tempted to say that the three Plotinian hypostases are roughly the three gods or absolutes of the three great philosophies which preceded him: Platonism, Aristotelianism, Stoicism, though always transposed into a Platonic key and connected, rightly or wrongly, with entities in the dialogues. The one, on this assumption, would be the God of Plato, the good of the Republic, identified with the absolute one of the Parmenides. The thought which thinks itself and in which being and intellect coincide would be the first principle of Aristotle. Lastly, the soul of the world would conjure up certain features of the absolute of the Stoics, the vital principle immanent in the world. Dean Ing, in his Error, historically, philosophically, and theologically, when he implies that there are in the Enneads virtually three gods and three absolutes, the soul of the world being the God to whom we pray for our temporal needs, the intellect which is the God of spiritual progress, of eternal life, and of celestial happiness, the one which is the ineffable divinity, Godhead rather than God, of the mystics wrapped into ecstasy. It seems extremely difficult to discover this separation of a single and identical goodness of a single and identical absolute, either in the writings of the great religious thinkers or in the souls of simple men of faith. It is clear also that the one is alone the absolute for Plotinus, that it corresponds with whatever or whoever we call God, whether we are philosophers, theologians, or minors. Nevertheless, it is true that the attributes which Christianity concentrates on a single being is triune God with three equal persons, are distributed by Plotinus among three hypostases which are at once distinct and unequal. The one being the source of all things, the intellect, the seat of self-thought and of the unchanging ideas, the soul of the world, the seat of providence, though it is far less a personal and voluntary power than an immanent and necessary ordering in the evolution of beings and events. Section 4. Structure and vocabulary of the mystical experience. To describe the path which leads to the mystical union, Plotinus uses three metaphysical metaphors and a thought pattern which is not metaphorical. 1. The road is an ascent, a movement upwards from below. The increase of intensity and of concentration is a rise. The dispersion and diminution of the experience is a fall. This is clear from the first lines of the treatise in dialect. The manner of speech in common to almost all the mystics, and even penetrates the language of everyday spatial terms like above and below, high and low, express not spatial relations, not even bare reality, but a scale of values. When he speaks of voices, he establishes an equivalence between the best of sounds and the sounds from on high. Plotinus is perfectly aware that this movement is not local, but metaphysical and moral. Olympiodorus, citing the most celebrated words of Plotinus, which had been cited by Ambrose and Augustine before him, and which placed the matter in the right focus, adds tersely, quote, not in space, but through one's life, end quote. When to describe the mystical union, Plotinus has recourse to the notion of presence, one of the most fundamental notions in the mystic's vocabulary. He writes, thus the Supreme, as containing no otherness, is ever present with us, we with it when we put otherness away. It is not that the Supreme reaches out to us seeking our communion. We reach towards the Supreme. It is we that become present. The Supreme Presence is at the summit of the ascent, but this ascent is psychological and moral. It is also within, since to be present to the other is to be at the center of oneself. 2. The second metaphor, spatial also, but without the emphasis on value, contrasts the external with the internal. The two schemes are combined in the opening of the Treatise 4. On the soul's descent, lifted out of the body into myself, becoming external to all things and self-centered. Yet there comes the moment of descent from intellection to reasoning. If the judgment of value is not expressed in the terminology itself, it is frequently associated with it, as at the end of 5, our self-knowledge is our beauty. In self-ignorance we are ugly. The equation between inferior and interior knowledge of oneself and knowledge of God, a mystical development of the idea of know thyself, is not peculiar to Plotinus. It is found, for example, in Clement of Alexandria. If a man knows himself, he shall know God. Augustine is thinking of Plotinus when he writes, quote, thus invited to retreat into myself, I penetrated to the inmost part of my being, and I saw shining above my spirit an unchangeable light. End of quote. Through Augustine, the theme continued to dominate all Christian mysticism. Richard of St. Victor expresses it with great force. Quote, in the spirit of man, the summit is one with the inmost recess. Through the ecstasy of the spirit, we are transported beyond supra, ourselves, or within, intra, ourselves, into the contemplation of things divine. End quote. In the two famous passages which describe the summit of the ecstasy in the vivid language of the mystery religions, the theme of inwardness is presented in terms of progressive penetration into the interior of the sanctuary, and here again penetration and elevation go together. He has risen beyond beauty. He has overpassed even the choir of the virtues. He is like one who, having penetrated the inner sanctuary, leaves the temple images behind him. When the soul begins to mount, it comes not to something alien, but to its very self. The corollary of this conception dominates the whole Plotinian doctrine of mystical purification. To purify is to remove what has attached itself from outside to the inmost self. In one, the initiate is invited to polish the statue which represents his true being, and to do this by removing all that is superfluous, adventitious, external, also called difference and otherness, in relation to the logical order of the one and the many. When you know what you have become, the perfect work, when you are self-gathered in the purity of your own being, nothing now remaining that can shatter that inner unity, nothing from without clinging to the authentic man. Now call up all your confidence, move upwards, yet a step. You need a guide no longer. Strain and see. The whole method, technique, training, device, and manner is summarized in the categorical imperative of Platonian mysticism. Cut away everything. The last words of the treatise 5. And this everything includes equally the sensible and corporeal realities which are exterior and inferior, and the multiplicity of concepts and ideas, also conceived as exterior and inferior to the pure unity of self and self with God. Arnu makes the profound observation that while purification might be conceived either as a material separation or as a detachment of the will, Plotinus, by assigning to the will a thoroughly unobtrusive role, is reduced to a conception which, in spite of his denials, comes very near to a material separation. A further result of this same conception is that salvation is not something to be achieved, but is achieved once and for all. Once the external has been removed and the inferior left behind, once the difference has been resolved, union is attained. 3. The third metaphor is that of a return to one's origins. This metaphor is closely bound up with Plotinian metaphysics and bears the characteristic hallmark of his system. The flight is an odyssey, a return to father and fatherland. The fatherland is the place from which we come and to which we return. The father is he from whom we take our leave, and the conception of father in Plotinus carries, it would seem, none of the emotional or religious connotations which the Christian world is accustomed to associate with it, but is rigorously synonymous with such exclusively metaphysical terms as principle, cause, or even source and root. The metaphysical equivalence of the first two metaphors, elevation and introversion, is accepted by Christian mysticism. The combination of these two with that of the return is not, except in the very wide sense that God is the creator and the origin of the human soul. In Plotinus, it is quite a different matter. Every being is constituted by means of two-way dynamism, which is dialectically simultaneous. The departure from the principle immediately prior and superior, and the return to that same principle. As a result, any being, whether the universal intellect or the individual soul, while it is not actually identical with its principle, This would be excluded by the law of diminishing causality, nevertheless exists in its self-identity only in the measure in which it is in an immediate relationship of union with and dependence upon its principle. In consequence, the being which knows itself will know also that from which it comes. Introversion is in the strictest sense reversion, or return upon one's principle. And since the principle is always superior to the product which derives from it and depends upon it, introversion is also elevation. The three metaphors coincide in a technical term whose significance is at once metaphysical and mystical. The term conversion. On the subject of intellect, Plotinus writes, its conversion upon itself is a conversion upon the principle. This, in fact, constitutes its supreme mystical experience because it is the foundation of its metaphysical structure. There is no other way of stating intellectual principle than as that which, holding itself in the presence of the good and first and looking towards that, is self-present also, self-knowing and knowing itself as all being. Only the one escapes this triple movement, since it is the end of the movement. It cannot rise upwards because it is already at the summit, neither can it descend in the emanation of those beings which go forth from it. It remains where it is, in itself. It cannot go inwards, since it is the center of all inwardness. It is finally incapable of conversion, in other words, of return upon its origin, since it is without origin, being by definition the principle from which all proceeds and to which all returns. 4. The fourth pattern of thought which underlies the whole of the Platonian mysticism, and in particular the ecstatic union of the soul with the One, is not metaphorical, but purely dialectical. It is the antithesis of the many and the one. This final pattern is superimposed upon the other three and gives them their metaphysical consistency. The union with God is unity, and it is a double unity. A. Unity of the being with itself by means of the return inwards and the eradication of all that belongs below, all that is external. B. Unity of the being with its first principle, the One, in which all duality, even the logical duality of subject and object in the self-thinking being, has necessarily disappeared. Numerous passages, including all the main descriptions of the mystical ecstasy, insist on the fact that these two unifications coincide. We may cite a passage whose general meaning is clear and significant enough, though it's highly involved. Construction makes any translation of it hazardous. The highest cannot be divided and allotted, must remain intangible but not bound to space. It may be present at many points, wheresoever there is anything capable of accepting one of its manifestations. Thus, a center is an independent unity. Everything within the circle has its term in the center, and to the center the radii bring each their own. Within our nature is such a center by which we grasp and are linked and held, and those of us are firmly in the Supreme, whose collective tendency is there. A final passage will show how the four fundamental themes interlace around the metaphor of the center, one of the most characteristic metaphors of Platonian metaphysics and mysticism. Every soul that knows its history is aware, also, that its movement, unthwarted, is not that of an ongoing line. Its natural course may be likened to that in which a circle turns not upon some external, but upon its own center, the point to which it owes its rise. The soul's movement will be about its source. To this it will hold, poised, intent towards that unity to which all souls should move, and the divine souls always move, divine in virtue of that movement. For to be God is to be integral with the Supreme. What stands away is man still, multiple or beast. The subsequent sentence shows that if the unity of the soul with itself goes pari passu with the unity of the soul with the one, the soul in the ecstasy does not for that reason lose its identity in the one. In other words, that Platonian mysticism is not pantheistic. Is then the center of our souls the principle for which we are seeking? We must look yet further. We must admit a principle in which all these centers coincide. The vocabulary of the mystical union is rich and varied. Plotinus continues to call it vision and contemplation, terms derived from the vocabulary of knowledge, but prefers either terms deriving from them of unity or those which indicate presence and contact. The terms used in the treatment of the unity theme are bold and challenging, as Plotinus recognizes the two are one. The subject becomes, so to say, another, is no longer itself, ceases to belong to itself. On the same theme, we find a host of variations upon identity, upon absence of difference and otherness, upon tranquility and stability, upon simplification, upon solitude. It is significant that the Enneads, as we read them in the arrangement of Porphyry, and with the words, the passing of the solitary to the solitary. The theme of presence and contact is also frequent. In one page alone, each of these terms is used half a dozen times. Actually, we have here a variant of the fundamental theme of unity, but it is noteworthy that a Greek philosopher should prefer, in describing the mystical union, expressions which are more appropriate to the sense of touch than to the sense of vision. To the same concrete and tactile phraseology belong two groups of complementary expressions: the giving of the self, which marks the activity and tension of the subject, and the terms rapture and enthusiasm, which mark his relative passivity, a passivity at least which does not imply any corresponding initiative or activity on the part of the object of contemplation. It is doubtful whether we ought to apply to this rapture the term ecstasis, which is very rarely found in Plotinus and does not necessarily bear the sense which it bore for Philo and which it will later receive from the Christian mystics, the sense of ecstasy. Machina prudently translates a going forth from the self, in which the voluntary tension is emphasized at the expense of the passivity and malleability. All these terms and all these themes have been taken over by the great speculative mystics of the Western world, on whom the influence, direct and indirect, of Plotinus and his school has been considerable. Two profound differences, perceptible even in their vocabulary, nevertheless separate Christian from Platonian mysticism: the doctrine of grace with the cognate doctrine of prayer, and the doctrine of anguish and of the mystical darkness. While Plotinus often describes the ecstasy in terms of vision and makes frequent use of the metaphor of light, especially to mark the immediacy of the vision and so to express once again the unity of the subject and the object of contemplation, his use of the terms apparition and manifestation is rare. In a passage which is imaginative rather than exact, the One appears as the king at the end of the advancing procession. He appears suddenly, an expression borrowed from Plato and applied more than once to the supreme vision. It would be possible to look in these two terms for an indication of the idea of grace and of self-giving on the part of the One, but the idea is utterly foreign to Plotinus' thought. If the vision is sudden, the reason is that it comes at the end of a dialectical process in which the One itself plays no part. If it appears, it is not in the sense of revealing itself. It remains within itself, extraneous and indifferent to all that comes after it. Plotinus sometimes speaks of prayer, and can even do so in a mystical context, describing the relationship of the soul with the One. But as the passage itself proves, prayer is a tension of the soul, the final leap in the dialectical process. It is not an appeal, not an expectation. It is neither the effect nor the occasion of a movement of grace or inclination on the part of God. In the passage of Augustine's Confessions, which is most directly inspired by the Enneads, and in which the parallelism of movement, ideas, and vocabulary is particularly close and constant, the words of Plotinus are, "Now call up all your confidence. You need a guide no longer. Strain and see." And Augustine, quoting from the Psalm, writes, "I entered even into my inward self, though being my guide, and able I was, for thou wert become my helper." In this inversion of a thought essential to Plotinus lies all the distance between Neoplatonic and Christian mysticism. Linked with the doctrine of sin and of grace, though it is not possible here to give the detailed evidence, is the doctrine of anguish and of mystical darkness, which will dominate the great contemplatives of Western, from Gregory of Nyssa and the Pseudo-Dionysius to the Cloud of Unknowing, to Nicholas of Cus's Docta Ignorantia, to the Dark Night of the Soul of John of the Cross. Plotinus does indeed speak of anguish and travail, but if the soul is multiple, and consequently in some sense divided, it is certainly not divided against itself. There is nothing in the Enneads to recall chapter 7 of the Epistle of the Romans, with its insistence that man can fail in what he wills. The soul for Plotinus is able, by purification, by the cutting away of everything, to choose at any time the level on which it will live. The absence of the notion of darkness is more significant still, because more unexpected. It seems to be called for by the logic of the system as another aspect of the negative theology, and it seems also to be presupposed by the very abundance of mystical imagery drawn from the field of light. Yet it is simply not there. The fact is that if for Plotinus the one is truly transcendent, and no one doubts that it is, the pagan philosopher did not know the specifically religious attitude of adoration. If some characteristic of his God belonged to the category of the fascinosum, more belonged to that of the tremendum. The one is within reach of the philosopher, not so much because it is interior to man's mind, as because the union does not presuppose either the one's spontaneous movement of love, grace, and mercy, or man's consciousness of his sinful and divided self. If the influence of Plotinus on the Christian mysticism of the West and of the East was incalculable, it remains true, nevertheless, that the principal and specific source of Christian mysticism is the biblical revelation. End of the introduction of Plotinus, the Enneads. Make sure to visit my book playlist to access the Enneads, and also please do hit like, share, and subscribe for more videos.